Administrative agencies' main task is policy implementation. That is the carrying out of decisions made by Congress, the President, and the courts. This task occurs for the most part within the confines of the federal budget. Agencies are limited to the level of funding that has been appropriated for particular activities. Now, implementation can be a relatively straightforward process in the case of agencies that are charged with the delivery of services, carrying the mail, processing welfare applications, approving government loans, and the like. Such activities are governed by rules, and in most instances, the rules determine what gets done. Nevertheless, agency employees have discretionary authority in many areas. The bureaucracy is far more than an administrative extension of the three branches of government. Administrative agencies make policy in the process of determining how to implement congressional, presidential, and judicial decisions. For example, the U.S. Forest Service has varied the way in which they've administered their dual-use policy of forest land. The dual-use policy of forest land balances the idea that forests should be preserved for their environmental heritage or allowing them to be opened up for logging companies. Depending on who's overseeing them, depending on the administration, has determined how this policy is carried out and implemented. In addition, because administrative agencies are so intertwined with policy, administrators can also develop policy ideas that they sometimes will propose either to the White House or Congress to create new legislation. In some, administrators not only initiate policy, they can help develop it, evaluate it, apply it, and decide whether others are complying with it. So it would be kind of foolish to just think about that the bureaucracy does not simply administer policy, but it also helps to make policy. A key issue about bureaucratic policymaking is the perspective that bureaucrats bring to their decisions. Do they operate from the perspective of the president, or do they operate from the perspective of Congress? The real answer is that although bureaucrats are responsive to both of them, they're even more responsive to the needs of the agency in which they work, a perspective called agency point of view. And it kind of makes sense when you look at who's leading these various bureaucratic agencies. More than 80% of the top bureaucrats reach high-level positions by rising through the ranks of the same agency, meaning they're working there for 10, 20, 30 plus years, and then all of a sudden going to lead it. In addition, high-level administrative positions have increasingly been filled by scientists, engineers, lawyers, educators, physicians, and other professionals. Most of them take a job in an agency whose mission they support, as in the case of aeronautical engineers who want to work for NASA, or in the case of doctors who want to work for the National Institute of Health. But in order to be successful, an agency must have to know how to navigate politically. If an agency is to operate successfully in this partisan system of divided power, it must seek to find support wherever it can. If the agency is a low priority for the president, it needs to find good backing in Congress. Republican lawmakers want to cut the agency's programs. It must turn to Democratic lawmakers for support. In other words, agencies are forced to play politics if they want to protect their programs. An agency that simply sits on the sideline while other agencies seek support from the White House or Congress is likely to lose out in the next budget negotiations. In promoting their agency's interests, bureaucrats rely on their specialized knowledge, the support of interests that benefit from their programs, and the backing of the President and Congress. The first source of bureaucratic power we want to look at is the power of expertise. Most of the policy problems confronting the federal government are extraordinarily complex. Whether the problem relates to space travel or hunger in America, a solution requires deep knowledge of the problem. Much of this expertise is provided by bureaucrats. They spend their careers working in a particular policy area, and many of them have had scientific, technical, or other specialized training. Elected officials, on the other hand, are more generalist, none more so than the president, who must deal with dozens of issues. Members of Congress can acquire some expertise through their committee work, but most of them lack the time, training, or inclination to become deeply knowledgeable of the issues they handle. Not surprisingly, Congress and the President rely heavily on career administrators for policy advice. No matter how simple a policy issue may appear at first, it is nearly always have layers of complexity. The recognition that the United States has a trade deficit with China, for example, can be the premise for policy change. But this recognition does not begin to address the basic issues such as the form of the new policy might take, its probable cost and effectiveness, and it links to other issues, such as America's standing in Asia. Among the officials most likely to understand these issues are the career bureaucrats in the Treasury, the Department of State, the Commerce Department, and the Federal Trade Commission. So I have the Drain the Swamp cartoon up there. From this perspective, because of these bureaucrats are considered experts in policy in their policy areas, it's always a good idea to drain the swamp. Most federal agencies were created for the purpose of promoting, protecting, or regulating a particular interest. Indeed, nearly every major interest in society, commerce, labor, agriculture, banking, and so on, has a corresponding federal agency. In most cases, these interests are clientele groups, in the sense that they benefit directly from the agency's programs. As a result, clientele groups, sometimes referred to as interest groups, can be counted on to lobby both Congress and the President on behalf of the agency when its programs and funding are being reviewed. The relationship between an agency and its clientele group is a reciprocal one, as you can see in the graph. Just as a clientele group can be expected to protect its agency, the agency will be expected to work to protect the group. The Department of Agriculture, for instance, is a dependable ally of farm interests year after year. The same cannot be said of the President or Congress as a whole, which must balance farmers' demands against those of other groups. Although the goals of the President or Congress can conflict with those of the bureaucracy, both entities need it as much as it needs them. An agency's resources, its programs, expertise, and group support can help elected officials achieve their policy goals. For example, when President Obama, early in his presidency, announced the goal of making the United States less dependent on foreign oil, he needed the help of the Department of Energy experts to develop programs that would further that objective. Agencies also have allies in Congress. Agencies with programs that benefit important key voting blocks are particularly likely to have congressional support. Prime example is the Department of Agriculture. Although the agricultural sector is just one of the President's many concerns, it is a primary concern of farm state senators and representatives, and they can be counted on to support Department of Agricultural funding and programs.